There are moments in sports that are supposed to be legendary. Moments that get replayed for decades, carved into highlight reels and referenced in documentaries years down the line. This was supposed to be one of those moments. The arena was packed, the cameras were rolling, the entire sports world had its eyes locked on one building, one court, one matchup. And then, in real time, in front of millions of people, the whole thing fell apart in the most spectacular, embarrassing, and deeply revealing way possible. Nobody saw it coming, or maybe, if they were paying close enough attention, everybody did. This wasn't just a bad game. Bad games happen all the time in professional sports. Sloppy shooting nights, defensive breakdowns, off days that get quietly forgotten by the following week. What unfolded on this particular evening was something entirely different. It was a complete unraveling, a public exposure of everything the league had been carefully papering over for months. The tensions, the resentments, the paper-thin relationships being sold to the public as genuine competitive fire, all of it cracked wide open under the pressure of one single night that the marketing department had built into something almost impossible to deliver on. And when the dust finally settled, nothing about women's basketball looked quite the same. To understand how catastrophically everything collapsed, you have to go back to the beginning, not tip-off, way before that. You have to understand what was promised, how aggressively it was sold, and just how massive the gap between the advertisement and the reality truly was. Because this story isn't just about two athletes having a bad night. It's about an entire institution gambling everything on a narrative it couldn't control and paying a devastating price when that narrative finally turned on them. The build-up to this game was unlike anything the league had ever attempted. For months leading up to tip-off, the marketing machine operated at an intensity that bordered on relentless. Every platform, every billboard, every commercial break during primetime programming featured the same two faces staring back at you. The message was unmistakable and deliberately calculated. This was the rivalry that was going to change everything. This was the moment women's basketball stepped out of the shadows and demanded to be taken seriously on the same level as any other major American sport. And for a while, it genuinely seemed like it might work. Ticket demand was staggering. The resale market exploded almost immediately after dates were announced, with prices climbing to levels that had never been seen for a regular season women's basketball event. Nosebleed seats that would normally sell for a fraction of their listed price were going for thousands of dollars on secondary platforms, driven entirely by the desperate desire of fans to say they were there, to witness what the league's own promotional material was calling a once-in-a-generation collision of talent, personality, and competitive hunger. Scalpers cleaned up. Vendors cleaned up. The league's revenue projections climbed to record territory before a single ball had been dribbled in a live setting. The executives behind this campaign were visibly thrilled with themselves. Internal reports suggested that pre-event sponsorship deals had been secured at rates that dwarfed anything the organization had previously negotiated, with major brands eager to attach themselves to what appeared to be a cultural moment in the making. Press conferences were standing room only. Media access requests poured in from outlets that had previously shown zero interest in covering the sport. For a brief, intoxicating stretch of time, it felt like the women's game had cracked some kind of previously unbreakable ceiling, and the people in charge were moving fast to monetize every single inch of the opening. But beneath all the noise, beneath the billboards and the sponsorship announcements and the breathless television previews, there were signals that something wasn't quite right. Signals that anyone paying close enough attention might have caught if they hadn't been so distracted by the spectacle being constructed around them. The hype was loud, deliberately, strategically loud. And sometimes when something needs to be that loud to get your attention, it's because the thing underneath it doesn't quite hold up on its own. The first sign that something was deeply off came during warm-ups, long before the introductions, long before the crowd had fully settled into their enormously overpriced seats. Athletes preparing for a game they genuinely care about carry a specific kind of energy.
There's a focus to their movements, a purposeful intensity even in the routine drills and casual shooting that precedes tip-off. You've seen it. The narrowed eyes, the sharp cuts during layup lines, the quiet, almost private conversations between teammates that look less like small talk and more like war planning. That energy was conspicuously, uncomfortably absent.
What observers noticed instead was a flatness that didn't match the occasion at all. Players moving through warm-up routines with the kind of mechanical, going through the motions energy you'd expect from a midweek practice with nothing on the line. There were no sharp exchanges between the two camps that would have at least suggested some genuine competitive edge. Instead, there was a strange, heavy distance. Not the charged tension of rivals who can't wait to get at each other, but the loaded silence of people who have unresolved issues they have no interest in addressing publicly. Courtside reporters noticed it. Veteran arena staff noticed it. A few sharp-eyed fans in the lower bowl noticed it and started exchanging uneasy glances. The coaching staff on both sides seemed aware that something was slightly off-kilter, making substitution decisions during warm-up rotations that felt less like strategic preparation and more like attempts to manage interpersonal dynamics that were already straining at the seams. There were brief, quiet sideline conversations that looked nothing like the animated tactical discussions you'd expect in the final minutes before a marquee event. They looked more like triage, like people trying to prevent a problem from becoming a crisis before the cameras went live. None of this made it into the pre-game coverage, of course. The broadcast was a celebration, a carefully choreographed countdown to greatness, complete with hype packages, dramatic music, and analysts talking over each other in their rush to predict just how incredible the evening was going to be. The narrative had been locked in for months, and nobody on the production side had any interest in complicating it with observations about strange vibes during layup lines. The show was going to go on, the story was going to be told the way it had been planned, and whatever was actually happening in that building was going to have to wait its turn. It didn't wait long. When the opening whistle finally blew, the reality of what this game was actually going to be landed like a cold bucket of water over the entire arena. Within the first 3 minutes, it was clear that the electric, high-intensity showcase that had been advertised to everyone who paid premium prices was not going to materialize, not even close. The pace was wrong from the start, not the controlled, deliberate slowdown that a disciplined team might employ to manage an opponent's transition game, but a sluggish, disorganized crawl that suggested nobody had particularly strong feelings about the outcome. Passes were floating where they should have been sharp. Defensive rotations were consistently half a beat late, leaving open looks that never should have existed at this level. The offensive sets that both teams ran looked rushed and disconnected, like plays being executed by people who hadn't spent nearly enough time actually talking to each other about what they were trying to accomplish. The crowd, which had been roaring during introductions with the kind of genuine, full-throated enthusiasm that money actually can buy, began to quiet in uncomfortable stages. First came the brief, confused silences after particularly egregious mental errors, the kind of plays that make a knowledgeable fan wince and turn to the person next to them with raised eyebrows. Then came the isolated groans scattered through the building like warning flares. And then, as the first quarter ground toward its end, without producing anything resembling the promised spectacle, a restless, dissatisfied murmur began to settle over the arena like a fog that nobody quite knew how to clear. Several players were visibly treating the evening as an obligation rather than an opportunity. The body language was impossible to miss for anyone who spent meaningful time watching professional athletes compete for something they actually care about. Jogging back on defense when the situation demanded sprinting, casually drifting to assigned spots on offense without the sharp, decisive movements that indicate genuine investment,
communicating through the mechanical, perfunctory calls that players make because coaches expect them to, not because they're actually locked into a competitive battle that demands constant adjustment and real-time problem-solving. It was, in the bluntest possible terms, a performance that had no business being sold at the prices people had paid to witness it. And in the stands, the realization was slowly and painfully dawning on thousands of people simultaneously. People who had rearranged schedules, bought flights, secured childcare, and stretched their budgets to be in that building on this particular night that they had been, in a very real and very expensive sense, had.
While the collective failure of the performance was impossible to ignore, the spotlight of real scrutiny landed almost immediately on one specific player whose struggles on the court were so glaring, so impossible to rationalize or explain away, that they became the focal point of everything that followed. Angel Reese walked onto that floor carrying the enormous weight of her own mythology. She had built something genuinely remarkable over the course of her career, a reputation for ferocious interior play, relentless rebounding, and a physical presence that could shift the entire dynamic of a game simply through sheer force of will. That reputation was not unearned. She had delivered, repeatedly and at the highest levels, performances that justified the hype surrounding her. None of that player showed up on this particular night. From the opening possessions, something was drastically and unmistakably wrong. The signature aggression that defined her interior game was nowhere to be found, replaced by a hesitancy and sluggishness that seemed to belong to an entirely different athlete. She was getting to the right spots, following the offensive schemes to the correct positions, positioning herself exactly where her coaches would have drawn it up in a film session, and then, when the ball arrived, she was missing. Not narrow misses that could be chalked up to tight defense or bad bounces. Uncontested layups, simple, routine finishes in the paint that any professional basketball player at any level on any given random Tuesday should be converting without a second thought. The first one you could dismiss as nerves, as the unusual pressure of the moment throwing off her usual rhythm. The second one raised eyebrows in the broadcast booth, prompting a brief, slightly awkward acknowledgement from the commentators who were clearly reluctant to start openly criticizing the players they'd spent months helping to promote. By the third and fourth missed layup, there was no comfortable narrative left to retreat to. Something was wrong. The commentators went quieter than they probably intended. The crowd began to shift from confused to openly frustrated. And on the court, the ripple effects of those missed opportunities were immediate and punishing, with the opposition converting the empty possessions into easy points at the other end with a regularity that started to feel almost cruel. What made it worse, what truly separated this from a simple shooting slump, was the response, or rather, the absence of one. A player who is off her game but still locked in competitively shows you something. She fights through contact even when the shots aren't falling. She crashes the offensive glass harder to manufacture second chances. She gets louder on defense to compensate for her struggles on the other end, channeling the frustration into something useful, something that at least communicates to her teammates and the crowd that she's aware of the problem and actively trying to solve it. None of that happened. The missed shots were followed by casual retreats up the court. The defensive breakdowns that resulted from failed possessions produced jogging recoveries rather than desperate scrambling. The body language communicated something that, in the charged atmosphere of that evening, was genuinely enraging to watch: indifference. The arena felt it. The broadcast team felt it. And roughly 10 feet away on the same court, a teammate with an entirely different relationship to the concept of indifference felt it more powerfully than anyone. Caitlin Clark is not built for nights like this. That's not an insult. It's practically the defining characteristic of her entire career and the source of both her greatest strengths and her most combustible moments. She operates at one setting, and that setting is absolute maximum competitive intensity regardless of the stakes, the opponent, the venue, or the scoreboard. Exhibition games, training sessions, charity events, it doesn't matter. The switch doesn't have an off position.
This quality is what made her a phenomenon long before she reached the professional level, and it's what has made her simultaneously the most exciting and most polarizing figure the sport has produced in a generation. So watching the game around her disintegrate into a sloppy, disconnected, low-effort mess was, for Clark, something close to a personal affront. She was out there doing what she always does, pushing the tempo every chance she got, threading passes through defensive gaps that most players wouldn't even attempt, calling out assignments with an urgency that suggested that she was the only person on the floor who had not received the memo that this particular game didn't really matter. Every time she engineered a half-decent offensive sequence, set up a teammate in a genuinely advantageous position, and watched the opportunity get casually squandered, something behind her eyes changed slightly. The encouraging claps after turnovers became shorter, more perfunctory. The vocal leadership started to carry an edge that hadn't been there at tip-off. Her gaze kept drifting to the bench with an expression that communicated volumes without requiring a single audible word.
She was carrying something heavy out there. Not just the weight of her own competitive expectations, but the particular, unique frustration of someone who has invested everything in an outcome and finds themselves increasingly unable to affect it because the people around them have simply decided to not match that investment. It's a specific kind of athletic suffering, the loneliness of caring in a space where the caring isn't shared, and it was written plainly across every tense line of her body as the minutes ticked by and the situation continued to deteriorate. The coaching staff could see it, courtside observers could see it. The broadcast cameras, hunting for a storyline in a game that was otherwise providing almost none, kept returning to her face, catching the subtle but unmistakable progression from focused intensity to barely contained exasperation. She was holding it together, but the thing about ticking bombs is that holding it together is a temporary state, and the clock had been running for a while. It happened during a chaotic transition sequence, the kind of brief, high-speed window in a basketball game where communication is essential and mistakes carry immediate, brutal consequences. The exact exchange lasted only a handful of seconds, but in those seconds, everything that had been building for months, the competitive resentments, the deeply divergent approaches to the game, the accumulated frustration of an evening that had been a catastrophic disappointment from nearly the opening tip, came bursting out in a way that nobody in the building was prepared for, and nobody on the broadcast team was quick enough to prevent. After yet another missed layup by Reese, one that led directly to an uncontested fast break score at the other end, adding insult to an already lengthy list of injuries, Clark broke. Not dramatically, not with the kind of theatrical, arms-waving breakdown that you might expect from someone releasing months of pent-up frustration. She broke quietly and with devastating precision, crossing the court during the stoppage and delivering what witnesses described as a sharp, controlled, absolutely venom-filled verbal message directed straight at Reese. The microphones didn't capture the exact words with enough clarity to make them broadcast ready. They didn't need to. The body language told the complete story. Lip readers and courtside journalists who were positioned close enough to piece together the exchange confirmed the general substance of what was said. Clark called out the effort level in terms that left absolutely nothing open to interpretation, reportedly telling Reese to either bring something real to the floor or remove herself from the situation entirely. The phrasing was reportedly pointed enough that it landed like a physical thing, visibly registering across Reese's face before the defensive walls went up. The response was instant. Reese didn't absorb the criticism quietly and redirect her energy toward the game. She fired back with equal ferocity, a rapid-fire retort that several nearby players would later describe to team insiders as something that effectively froze everyone within earshot. For a few seconds that felt significantly longer than they actually were, the game ceased to exist. There was just these two athletes, two different worldviews, two fundamentally incompatible relationships with competition and accountability, occupying the same small patch of hardwood and making absolutely no attempt to conceal the depth of their mutual contempt in that specific moment. The cameras caught the edges of it,
Not enough to tell the complete story on their own, but more than enough to confirm that something seismic had just occurred. The broadcast cut away to a crowd shot with the kind of hasty, awkward timing that immediately tells experienced viewers that something has happened which the production team is not equipped or inclined to address directly. But by then, dozens of phones had already captured the exchange from various angles in the lower bowl, and the footage was already making its way onto the internet with the speed that no amount of editorial discretion was going to outrun. The fallout was already in motion. The only question remaining was how far it would go. The answer, as it turned out, was very far. Almost immediately after the footage began circulating, social media didn't just respond, it detonated. Twitter and TikTok transformed within the space of an hour from platforms where people were venting general disappointment about an underwhelming game into something that felt more like a coordinated uprising from a consumer base that had reached a collective breaking point. The clips of the missed layups and the on-court confrontation spread with the kind of velocity that algorithms reserve for content that triggers genuine emotional responses, and the emotional response this triggered was, to put it generously, intense. Fans who had paid extraordinary amounts of money to attend in person were among the loudest and most specific in their outrage. These weren't vague complaints about the quality of the game. They were detailed, receipts-included, dollar-amount-cited demands for accountability from people who felt they had been the victims of a sophisticated and deliberate bait-and-switch. Posts enumerating exactly how much had been spent on tickets, travel, accommodation, and merchandise, juxtaposed against descriptions of what they'd actually witnessed, went viral repeatedly throughout the evening and into the following morning. The league's official accounts were buried under an avalanche of responses that made the standard social media negativity look mild by comparison.
The narrative shifted with a completeness and a speed that the league's communications team was clearly not prepared for. Within hours, the conversation was no longer about basketball at all. It was about trust, about whether the entire enterprise of marketing this rivalry had been, from the very beginning, a cynical exercise in selling emotion over substance. Viral posts began cataloging the specific promises that had been made in promotional materials, words like historic, unmissable, the defining moment, and holding them up against the footage of casual jogging and blown layups with a prosecutorial precision that was hard to watch if you had any stake in the league's credibility. The accusations of a staged or pre-planned underwhelming performance, while largely unverified and almost certainly inaccurate as a literal claim, gained traction because they gave shape to a feeling that was otherwise difficult to articulate, that somehow someone had known this was going to happen and had chosen to sell it anyway. Whether or not that was true in any literal sense, the emotional logic of it resonated powerfully with a fan base that felt humiliated and exploited. The league's attempts at damage control, carefully worded statements about competitive effort and the inherent unpredictability of live sport landed with approximately the credibility you'd expect from an institution addressing people who had just watched the very specific things they'd been promised failed to materialize in real time. This was not a news cycle that was going to fade quietly in 48 hours. It had the kind of organized, sustained energy that comes from people who feel genuinely wronged, and it was only going to get louder before it started to quiet. While the public-facing disaster played out across every social platform in real time, an entirely separate and significantly more consequential drama was unfolding behind the doors that the cameras and the journalists couldn't follow the players through. The locker room after that game was, by multiple accounts that leaked out through team insiders in the days that followed, an environment that bore no resemblance to the carefully managed, professionally composed spaces that athletes present to the media in post-game press conferences. The team fractured almost immediately, not gradually, not through the slow accumulation of small disagreements that might build over the course of a long season, but quickly and cleanly along fault lines that had apparently been developing for a significant period of time before that evening simply brought them into sharp relief.
Some veteran players, the ones with enough standing and enough genuine investment in the team's future to care about the immediate situation, stepped into the breach and attempted to de-escalate before things progressed beyond a point of no return. Their efforts were partially successful in the narrowest sense. No physical altercation occurred, no one said anything in a large group setting that would have made the situation completely unrecoverable. But the deeper damage was of a kind that doesn't respond to veteran leadership and measured appeals to professionalism and collective purpose. Others quietly sided with Clark. Not loudly, not publicly, but in the specific way that tells you everything about where the actual sentiment lies, pulling away from Reese's corner of the room, letting the silences stretch in ways that communicated unmistakable support for the frustrations Clark had expressed on the court. There were conversations in corners, conducted in voices too low to carry, the kind of conversations that aren't secret because of what's being said, but because of their very existence reveals the state of the relationships in that room. Lockers were not treated gently. The standard end-of-game rituals, the handshakes, the brief exchanges about the game, the collective processing of a difficult experience happened in a curtailed, perfunctory way that stripped them of any genuine meaning. The press conference quotes that emerged from this environment were predictably immaculate in their uselessness, carefully constructed non-statements about the challenges of elite competition, the importance of using difficult experiences as learning opportunities, and the strength of character required to respond positively to adversity. Nothing that reflected anything that had actually occurred in that building in the preceding 2 hours. The media, accustomed to the particular architecture of post-game damage control, absorbed these quotes with the resigned understanding that the real story was going to have to be assembled from the edges rather than the center. What those edges revealed, pieced together over the days that followed, was a team environment that had been under significantly more internal stress than any of the public-facing messaging had suggested. The chemistry problems weren't new, the factions weren't new. The gap between what was being marketed to the public and what was actually happening in the spaces where the cameras weren't rolling had been wider than anyone with an official stake in the narrative was prepared to acknowledge. The game hadn't created the fracture, it had simply removed the last of the insulation that had been keeping it from full public exposure.
The league's front office woke up the morning after to a situation that no amount of crisis management experience fully prepares you for, because the specific combination of factors in play was uniquely damaging in ways that a single problem, a bad game, a player controversy, a social media backlash, would not have been on its own. All three had converged simultaneously, and they were feeding each other in a cycle that showed no immediate signs of breaking. The sponsor conversations were, by all reports, extremely uncomfortable. Brands that had paid significant sums to associate themselves with what had been sold to them as a premium, culturally resonant moment were now associated instead with the most discussed sports fiasco of the week. The footage being shared most widely across social platforms was not the footage that any of those deals had been structured around. Legal teams were quietly reviewing contracts. Marketing executives at several partner companies were having conversations about contingency plans. The league's revenue team, which had been celebrating record partnership numbers only weeks before, was now in the deeply unpleasant position of fielding calls from people who wanted to discuss what the fine print said about scenarios that nobody had seriously entertained when the ink was still drying. The strategic miscalculation at the center of all this was now impossible for anyone in the building to avoid confronting directly. The entire approach had been built on a foundational assumption that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. That the drama surrounding the Clark-Reese dynamic could be marketed as a substitute for on-court excellence rather than a complement to it. That the personalities alone, the rivalry and the tension and the cultural electricity that surrounded both athletes were sufficient to carry an event regardless of what actually happened between the lines once the ball went up. Fans proved with considerable force and considerable financial specificity that this assumption was entirely wrong.
The people who had paid the most, who had traveled the furthest, who had invested the deepest emotional capital in the evening, these were not casual consumers who could be satisfied with proximity to celebrity. These were committed, knowledgeable supporters of a sport they cared about, and what they wanted was to see that sport played at the highest possible level on the most important possible stage. When it wasn't, they didn't shrug and move on. They organized, they documented, and they held the institution accountable in public with a thoroughness that the institution's communication strategy was simply not equipped to handle. Emergency planning sessions were convened, conversations about how to reframe the upcoming season's marquee events, how to adjust the marketing approach, how to address the credibility gap that this single night had torn open, ran late into the evenings of the following week. The scramble was visible enough from the outside that even the people who weren't supposed to know about it quickly figured out that something significant was being restructured behind the scenes. The confidence that had characterized the league's public posture in the months leading up to the game was conspicuously absent from everything that came after. In its place was something that looked uncomfortably like an institution that had badly overextended itself and was now trying to figure out how to pull back without making the retreat look as desperate as it actually was. The deeper wound inflicted by this entire episode isn't the one that shows up in the next quarter's revenue projections or the adjusted ticket pricing models for future events. Those are real, and they're going to sting for a while, but they're manageable in the way that financial setbacks are manageable, with time, with adjustments, with the eventual return of results good enough to shift the conversation. The deeper wound is to something more fragile and more essential than money. The trust of a fan base that the sport spent years slowly, painstakingly trying to build. Women's basketball has existed for decades in the difficult position of a sport that is genuinely excellent but chronically underappreciated, constantly having to make a case for its own legitimacy against a sports media landscape that was not built with it in mind and does not naturally incline toward covering it. The breakthrough that the league appeared to be experiencing in the months before this game was not accidental. It was the product of years of sustained effort, player development, improved broadcast deals, savvy social media strategy, and yes, the organic, genuine, compelling storyline that the Clark-Reese dynamic had essentially provided for free. Fans had been coming to the sport through that story, and many of them had stayed because the actual basketball was good enough to hold them.
What this night threatened was not just the superficial goodwill of casual observers, who are always going to be the most volatile part of the audience. It threatened the relationship with the core supporters, the people who had been there before the current wave of attention, who had been evangelizing the sport to their friends and family, who had skin in the game beyond just whether a particular rivalry delivered on its hype. These are the people who feel genuine embarrassment on the sport's behalf when something like this happens, who absorb the social media jokes and the sports radio dismissals as personal affronts, who need to believe that the institution they've been advocating for is worthy of that advocacy. Rebuilding that specific kind of trust is not quick work. You don't accomplish it with a well-worded press release or a successful next event that goes exactly as planned. You rebuild it with consistency over time, with repeated demonstrations that the people running the sport understand what the people watching it actually value and are committed to delivering it regardless of whether the cameras are rolling. It requires a fundamental shift in the internal conversation from "how do we sell this" to "how do we make this genuinely great?" And that shift, if it's going to mean anything, has to go all the way down to the locker room level, to the players themselves, to the question of whether the relationship at the center of the league's entire marketing identity is going to continue generating value or continue generating exactly this kind of damage. Which brings everything, eventually, back to the two athletes at the center of this particular storm. Because whatever the league decides, whatever the sponsors demand, whatever strategic pivots the front office implements over the next several months, the fundamental dynamic that produced this catastrophic evening hasn't actually changed. Clark and Reese are both still here. Their history is still what it is.
The competitive incompatibility that erupted on that court didn't get resolved in the locker room afterward. It got suppressed at best and postponed. The next time these two share a floor with significant stakes attached, all of the unresolved material is going to be right there with them. There are two possible versions of how this story continues, and neither of them is simple. In one version, the severity of this particular public failure functions as a genuine wake-up call, not just for the athletes individually, but for the relationship between them, for the understanding of what their rivalry can and cannot sustain. In this version, the embarrassment of this night becomes the pressure that eventually forces a different kind of reckoning, one that leads to a more honest and ultimately more productive engagement between two extraordinary competitors who might discover that channeling their mutual intensity into the actual game produces something more compelling than anything the marketing department could manufacture on their behalf. Rivalry, when it operates at this level and produces this kind of heat, can be the engine of greatness. The history of sports is full of examples. It requires both parties to choose the craft over the conflict. In the other version, the toxicity compounds. The resentments that were aired in that brief, ferocious exchange don't diminish, they calcify, growing harder and more entrenched with every passing interaction until the relationship becomes genuinely unmanageable, and the league is forced to make decisions about how to structure future events that prioritize damage prevention over authentic competition. This version is worse for everyone, worse for the athletes, worse for the sport, worse for the fans who genuinely love both players and want to watch them compete at their highest level, rather than manage their animosity at the lowest one. Which version comes to pass depends on choices that haven't been made yet, on conversations that haven't happened, on whether the people involved can separate the personal from the professional with enough clarity to recognize what this sport has given them both and what they owe it in return. That's a harder thing to market than a rivalry. It doesn't fit neatly on a billboard, but it's the only thing that actually matters in the end, the only variable that will determine whether this night gets remembered as the low point before something genuinely great, or as the moment when the whole beautiful, fragile thing started to break apart for real. What happened in that arena wasn't just a sports story. It was a mirror held up to an entire industry's relationship with authenticity. And the reflection, for everyone who had a stake in what they saw, was profoundly uncomfortable. The question now isn't whether women's basketball can recover from one bad night. It's whether everyone involved, the athletes, the executives, the sponsors, the broadcasters, are willing to do the unglamorous, unmarketed, unviral work of actually deserving the audience that was, until very recently, finally paying attention. That work doesn't happen under bright lights. It doesn't generate trending hashtags or break streaming records. It happens in practice facilities and film sessions and honest, difficult conversations in spaces where the cameras don't follow. It's the part of the story that never makes the highlight reel, but it's the part that decides everything that does.